From Chicago, welcome to 3Degrees Discussions. I'm your host, Mike Vasquez. This is a podcast devoted to the stories behind the innovators, entrepreneurs, and leaders in the 3D printing industry.
The transition from like 2010 to 2014 or 2016 when I left was really that like dawning of 3D printing was like a term. And we would have like generals come in and be like, oh, have you guys heard about this thing called 3D printing? And we'd look around the room and be like, yeah, we've been doing it a while.
That was Lester Hitch. Lester has been in the additive manufacturing space for nearly 20 years, much of that time spent working for the U.S. Army. He joined the show today to share his experience working hands-on with the technology and developing new products, materials, and approaches to improve the technology. Lester is currently an application consultant at DyeMansion, where he supports customers working to improve the surface finish and appearance of their 3D printed parts. Before we get started, head over to www.3degreescompany.com and subscribe to the podcast. And we can listen to the show anywhere you download your podcasts, including Spotify, Apple, Amazon, or Stitcher. All right, Lester, appreciate you joining the podcast today. I think we got a lot to talk about given your 20-year career in this space. So I like to start these with some context of kind of the person, who's the person that I'm talking to. So where'd you grow up? Kind of what was your kind of early days like in terms of kind of getting on the path towards manufacturing and building stuff with your hands?
Yeah, no, and thanks as well for, taking this time to share with me. I'm happy to be here to participate in this podcast with you. So like I'm a Maryland guy. What I would say, like we're one of the more prideful states when it comes to our flag. I think we're only rivaled by a few other states within the country, but we put it on everything from apparel and whatnot. But yeah, I've lived in Maryland my whole life. I love the Mid-Atlantic. I love the 4 seasons that we get here. I always tell people they're never as long as you want them to be, and when you're tired of them, they're ready to transition to the next one. So. But yeah, I grew up in this area. I'm the son of a National Guardsman, and my mother worked in the government career sector as well. And once we kind of settled where I call home, it's a little town called Havre-de-Grace, butchering of the French language, at the very top of the Chesapeake Bay. I lived in that area, grew up there. I was a kid who grew up with a long leash. I would ride my bike, many miles to the neighboring town, to the Army base, and enjoy the swimming pool, in the summertime while my parents both worked. But kind of growing up in that environment and my father were big influences on me, kind of always being into like mechanical things. So like with that bike, I was always fixing it. I always kind of traveled around with like a little set of Allen keys to fix different things if I was out on the road and things broke. Working with my father alongside him on car maintenance and things like that. So I've always had this like interest of working with my hands and tinkering with things. And so I was kind of going through high school. I started to kind of think about like what it was that I wanted to do, and I kind of leaned towards engineering. But frankly, by the time I had that realization, it was a little, I'd say, too late. And I was very much like a coaster through school, if I'm being honest. I was very happy with, the C's get degrees kind of motto. And so I went through community college to kind of get my bearings on what college, education would be like. And that's kind of like where I would say my luck turned around. And it's also one of those experiences where it's always made me an advocate to other people who might have kids or younger people that I might meet kind of with the same question mark of what path to take. I'm like, college is definitely a pathway, but if you're not sure about it, maybe don't jump into like a big expensive 4-year school. I think a lot of people kind of today, particularly for my generation, have this mindset. So maybe try community college. It's definitely a good place to like affordably figure that system out if it's a direction you want to take.
And what's the, like for people who may not have a lot of direct experience with community college or looking at those options now, like what would you say the biggest difference is between community college and kind of your standard college university setting?
Yeah, well, so first things cost. I think for sure, like growing in an area that has like a pretty rich community college environment, here in Maryland, there's very many of them that are also linked directly with the different four-year universities around here. So largely it's cost. So you figure your first year, especially in a college program at a four-year university, you're going through what basically everyone considers core curriculum. So it's like, why spend all that money on a state school or a big university when you can get the same kind of education realistically for the same topics at a much lower cost? And then so like affordability was a big thing. Like my parents, we didn't come from money or anything like that. So I actually worked a second job. I worked at a kayak shop off the water, and that was my source of income for getting through school by and large part. So that was a big factor. And then after that, it gives you like a little bit of like I guess the safety net of, still living at home. The campus was real small. So you would typically park in like a commons area, and then you'd have like, you'd walk around campus between your schools. Some people, I think, liken it akin to like an extra level of high school. That's just more of a free floating program for students to navigate before being thrusted into like this immersive college experience.
Sure. And so you're kind of start your path on community college, kind of what happens next?
Yeah. So I was taking general studies because, again, I didn't really know what I want to do, but I took a concentration in 2D and 3D CAD, computer aided drafting and design. So in that, like, it was definitely an area that I knew I really liked. And after like the first semester, which was like for me a spring semester of my first year, an internship opportunity came available with a local government agency on the Army base Aberdeen Proving Grounds. And they were looking for people to support them in their 2D and 3D modeling space. And they actually interviewed me and another student. They hired us both. And when I showed up for that first day, they said, well, you actually don't have a lot of CAD experience, and the other guy does, because he actually went through a vocational tech school through high school on that same focus. So he was well more experienced. But they were like, we have this thing called 3D printing, and we really could use some extra help in the lab. So I was like quickly thrusted into this, state-of-the-art facility. They had a new DTM machine, the predecessor to 3D systems. They had a big FDM quantum machine, and then they had a SLA 3500 printer, and they needed someone to clean parts. So I started working in there, kind of doing dual duty with that and the CAD stuff. And after about a summer of working there, it was a great job. I told them, I was like, hey, can I keep working here? Because it's pretty typical of the summer students to go back to their universities. And they're like, well, yeah, but you'd have to be here during the day to like make it worth, our while. I was like, that's cool. I haven't registered for classes yet. So I like immediately made all my classes night classes as much as possible. And so from there, I was 19 at this rate. I actually started that job on my birthday. So it's like tends to be a memory. So like at that rate, I was like thrusted into 3D printing, and I just got hooked. Like, even though I was just cleaning parts, I was able to kind of see what was going on. And by the end of that summer, I was setting up builds. So I started like get more of an understanding of what was going into it. And then plus like having the CAD knowledge, I saw the pathway of like taking something from a digital space and seeing it come to life, out of the printers.
And what was the context for having all that equipment there? Was it purely prototyping? Was that kind of an R&D center? What were you guys? What was the mission for that?
Yeah, so that was a pretty unique facility. Forgive me because I'm not fresh on like what their current name is, because the government military agencies change their names all the time. Changed frequently while I was there. But yeah, the main group worked on what was called at the time the Edgewood Chemical Biological Center on Aberdeen Proving Grounds here in Maryland. And their core mission was, prototype product development support for any kind of like devices, testing apparatus, what have you, whether it was something for a lab purely conceptual, proof of concept, or if it was something that was, going to be thrown into an experimental system, or possibly even in the hands of a soldier or a scientist in the field. They were this group that like focused on that chem bio detection and protection type of engineering and science. But the unique thing about them was they also, as I was there for about 14 years throughout my career, through all that time, they've always supported local industries through cooperative research and development agreements. And so we supported, your Joe Schmo who came off the street. I always make the joke, if you had a salad chopper that you wanted to make for QVC, they would help you, no matter how much engineering support you needed, little or a lot, they'd help you with all that stuff. And then we would help you, print it through the lab and bring it to life. And then beyond that, they also were like a service bureau for other DoD agencies, military and government, that needed work as well. Because, so they were able to justify kind of having all that technology in there because, they had a whole subtractive, I think at the time it was 30,000 square feet of subtractive, traditional manufacturing technologies, including injection molding, the sheet metal, welding, all that fabrication type of effort. So 3D printing was just like another piece of that puzzle for them.
Did you gravitate towards any one part of the process? Like, did you like the post-processing part? Did you like setting up builds and design, running the printer?
Well, so this was back in early 2000s. So I would say at the time, post-processing probably wasn't my favorite part of the equation at the time. I think as like an operator back then, where the software was like a little bit more basic, we didn't have like materialize like everyone so commonly does nowadays. So there became this like pride with like how well you would set up a build, especially if it was on something I would say risky, or if you were aggressive on, part placement and, how much support you had on like an SLA build and, did it build or not, basically. Like, if you walked in the next day with a crash, was it because you got too aggressive with the supports, or did something just kind of freak happen in the machine? So that like whole setting things up and seeing the end result, definitely I felt like kind of hooked you in. And it was always just enjoyable to develop that knowledge of like what would work and what wouldn't, to make a build successful.
So you started with there, you're like 19, 20, kind of working there, transitioned to full-time. Like, did you stay there full-time, kind of climbing the ranks?
Yeah. So I came on as what they call student contractor. And then I got like hired on as a temporary contractor, like a traditional contractor, through like a third party company. And then I ultimately got hired on as a full-time, GS government, employee. And that took about, I think that was about a 4-year transition from when I first started.
Nice. And what's it? I mean, what was your like day-to-day kind of life there? What were you kind of working on in the lab and around the shop?
So day to day, each day, particularly, start with a Monday. You'd come in and, you would observe, your builds that ran over the weekend. And, based on like the timing of everything, you check out your builds, start processing what was, successful or not, clean up the messes if there was any kind of left behind. And then you pretty much like would clean slate everything, whether it was going to be for builds coming in like later that day, or just knowing that there was more work coming down like throughout the rest of the week. So you'd hand those parts off to the engineer or the scientist or other customer that you're working with, and probably have some dialogue, I guess, on like, how things came out, what would like the next steps be if required, and kind of go from there. And that would kind of like repeat, throughout the week. It might sound repetitious, but that's the great thing about 3D printing is we're often doing like the same work over and over again. So it always kind of kept it fresh.
Yeah. And so how long did you spend at that position?
Yeah, so I was there overall for 14 years, starting from, moving powder and resin and picking up filaments and all that such. To about the time I left, we moved facilities. And so I was like a big part of like planning the layout of the new facility and pretty much handling the day-to-day production workflow of the facility. And by that point, we went from three main technologies to about a dozen or so, industrial printers, and maybe another, I think at that time we had like maybe another 10 or so consumer grade printers, because this was about the transition from like 2010 to 2014 or 2016 when I left, was really that like dawning of 3D printing was like a term. And we would have like generals come in and be like, "Oh, have you guys heard about this thing called 3D printing?" And we'd look around the room and be like, yeah, we've been doing it a while. So it became like this thing where we had to like really get into like the desktop printers just to kind of like validate them and experiment with them. And then sometimes just, accept a free gift when it was given to us by someone else's funding. But yeah, I was there for about 14 years, and yeah, it was a great place. It was a little bittersweet when I left, but I knew I kind of hit like a point in my career with the government, where I knew I was looking for more and like a different challenge. So that's when I kind of started to look elsewhere, for different opportunities.
And along that time, I mean, I imagine you saw a lot of different projects kind of coming through. Were you always, I mean, you were pretty early on with like the DTM and the early adopter status. Were you always getting kind of the newest, like latest and greatest, like top secret kind of serial number one printer?
So I think that nothing that crazy. But yeah, we were doing our best to stay on top of it. Because as much as like we had like, I would say, an advanced interest, at the end of the day, we're the government, so we couldn't always necessarily move fast enough to bring in like something at the alpha or even like the early beta level of like a product. And not to mention like the government, at least at that time, they weren't big about accepting stuff for free. There always had to be some kind of like ownership about it. And if not, that wasn't something that they necessarily wanted to give back. Yeah, there was a few machines that we got. Like we were an early beta tester for the Object Connex 500 when it first came to the United States. And then within that, we often did more beta testing on materials. So that was like more of our interest, I would say, is like, let's get a developed technology in here, because a lot of what we were producing wasn't so much R&D as it was like design evaluation and, end use application type kind of development. So was 3D printing going to be the end use product, or could we use 3D printing to bring a product to market faster, essentially? So materials were like a big part of that. And even like, with softwares and stuff like that, we were always trying to stay on top of things. But the Object Connex was one that stood out, as we were definitely early adopters of that one, which was cool. It was all these, materials mixing together, and it was different than SLA, but similar. So yeah, that was a cool one to get hands on early.
Gave your lab a nice smell when you walked in the morning.
Smell, and unfortunately a puddle.
Yeah.
Yeah, those waste bins or something. Yeah, they would always have a little bit of a leak under there. But yeah, so that was a fun one. And then yeah, just working on, I remember like the first time I worked with like a carbon fiber filled nylon material for powder bed. And like you weren't really given like much direction, from the supplier on how to make it work. And stuff like that. And I remember, I think it was wintertime, because I remember putting a jacket on after working with it all day. And, it felt like I was playing around in fiberglass insulation all day, because, there was, what's PPE back in the early 2000s. So yeah, it was just like learning those lessons about handling certain materials differently than others were big takeaways in some of those experiences.
And were you involved in like how did you build your kind of network of other users? Were you involved in like AMUG at this time too? Kind of did you have kind of a resource of people that you were like, hey, like you got this machine, like have you seen this problem?
Yeah, so I think it was 2003 was my first opportunity to go to AMUG, but unfortunately, I was still a student contractor at the time, so it's not like I could travel on my own. And the week of prior to leaving for AMUG, my supervisor got appendicitis, so it was like crushed dreams immediately because I've heard about this thing, and at that point, 2003, it wasn't even AMUG. It was I think it was still just the SLS users group. They were still separate between SLS and SLA. And so it was 2004, which I think was the first 3D SUG, 3D Systems users group that I got to go to. And yeah, that was like my first time to meet like the bigger industry, which is kind of funny to say bigger at that point, because I think attendance at that stage was like a few hundred people compared to what it is now. But it was my first time to be there, and beyond meeting service technicians and a few salesmen, I got to meet other users, have that engagement that AMUG is just so awesome for, with other users, and just technically talk about things and learn that I wasn't the only one having like a certain struggle, and in some cases learning that like I might have had added value to someone else's kind of situation. So yeah, I started going to AMUGs and Rapids, and then even like as like STEM and 3D printing got more involved, we worked very closely with like the local STEM area. And then as Maryland as a government got involved a little bit more, working with different programs through the state, whether it was again school stuff or educating just different delegates, and manufacturing boards involved with the state on what 3D printing was. All those types of engagements definitely helped me build the network that I have today.
So kind of back to your career story. So you have all this experience, you spent kind of over a decade kind of working on the various processes, SLS, SLA, material jetting. Like what in your mind did you want to do? Like, because you had all this experience, like what were you doing product development as well? So like it seems like you had like a lot of different directions you could look at both within additive and outside of additive. Like, did you have an idea of like, I know I don't like what I'm doing now, or I don't see kind of the pathway forward, like, but did you have an idea of like what you want to do next?
Yeah, exactly. So I had a loose idea, and I really just knew that I wanted to see what was out there beyond like the government, because I had some opportunities to just transition over to like another government agency, but it would have been like true R&D. And frankly, like at that time, I had zero interest in doing R&D. Like those same groups always kind of came through our labs and wanted to do R&D with us. And we were very much like production mindset, and just to kind of like put the brakes on and do focused R&D, just wasn't in my nature at that time. So I was thinking like, if I want to like diversify my career a little bit more, like what's one thing I'm maybe lacking through either education or formal career experience. And that was like something in the sales or like application, like engineering consulting type of space. So I kind of just started like to browse my network a little bit and see like what were my strongest connections to get me in that direction. And it so happened to work out that I had some really good connections with the guys of Integra Service, which is now a part of EOS. At the time, they were independent and getting merged into EOS. And I also had a good connection with the material developers at Advanced Laser Materials, which is also now a part of EOS. So I started engaging with them. It felt like 2 years, like all before they kind of started working for EOS. I felt like it took me about 2 years to get like the feelers out there and to truthfully get myself like mentally prepared to leave like the safety net that is the government. And it was 2016 when like everything aligned, and the mergers of ALM and Integra and EOS had really started to stabilize, even though it was still early days back then. And yeah, they were growing, so they needed people with experience to kind of help them out with like their what they called aftermarket sales support at the time, but it ultimately evolved into the lifecycle solutions team, which focused primarily on like the material conversation engagement between customers and sales and the applications team.
Okay, and so is that as people are starting their like, hey, we just bought a P300 and we need to understand these materials better, and or we're looking at trying elastomers or something else.
Yeah.
Like what sort of issues were people coming to you guys with?
Yeah, so like with powder bed, I mean, let's be honest, like 90% plus of the market is PA12. So it's like, it's real easy for everyone to just kind of check that box and run with it. But it was always great when we met with certain customers in different spaces that wanted something more technical beyond just like your standard PA12. So it was a matter of like understanding what was available within the EOS and ALM material portfolio, and also like engaging with everybody involved, you know, the customer, engineering, process development out of Germany. You know, hey, we've got this, you know, 40% glass filled, you know, material that has a pinch of carbon fiber and like a pinch of, you know, flame retardancy. Can we run this in their P3 system? And often the answer was, well, we haven't done it yet, but, you know, we're willing to try. So I would kind of like help manage that expectation of this is a possibility. But, you know, here's kind of like what the timeline is going to ultimately look like to kind of bring this on board, you know, through the platform, knowing that it is like a developing process. But often it was that kind of engagement where the customer knew they needed more out of like the standard material offering or the standard process.
And so was the idea that you had kind of your own printer's toy set at EOS, at ALM, and customers kind of come to you, or are you kind of going to their site to say, hey, we want to run this material type of thing?
Yeah. So honestly, I wish it was probably more of that situation, but at the time, I was still living in Maryland. So I've been doing remote work before COVID and remote work became a thing. So ideally, I think at that time, as I kind of matured in that position, and it was actually a transition I tried to make happen, I probably should have been more closely linked to the material at the machine and like the process development and some of like the recipe, development with the different scientists and engineers between all of that. But I wasn't. So really what I became was just this person who coordinated, you know, the multiple effort of all these different teams, you know, basically a project manager of all these different entities wanting to come together towards the same goal, and then really helping like to manage the customer expectation like around those timelines and around those, you know, possible results, which frankly, like, even though I didn't really realize it, was a lot of what I was doing for the 14 years that I was working for the Army, and supporting all the different groups out there was really that project management, that customer engagement, even though I felt like I never had any formal experience with it. And I discounted what I had in terms of knowledge and capability, just because I didn't really know any better. Once I got out in the private industry, I realized I had built up all these skills and I was comfortable talking technically to people and also managing like projects of this kind of like complication.
And so, so you're at kind of EOS, ALM, kind of what's the next transition in your career?
Yeah, so I was there for about 4 years, and you know, so this was approaching 2020. So through 2019, I started, you know, engaging internally with the teams there to see actually if I could make that move to Texas and work more closely. And it got to, I'd say, a situation where there was nothing that ended on bad terms or anything, but it was at a point when EOS was maybe looking at kind of like a concentration of growth. They weren't really expanding so much anymore. So there was an opportunity to move to Texas, but it wasn't like a guarantee of being able to do what I wanted to do. They still needed someone like in my position, and in the team that I was within, I had the most experience in that role. So it was one of those situations of like, yeah, you can move to Texas, you can kind of take on more work. But, you know, there's no guarantees that we could give you a promotion or anything towards that end. in the short-term future. So at that time, I had a close friend who was in the midst of his own startup business. So I started communicating with him more about what he had going on. This company turned out to be Additive Accelerator with Alan Guyan. So I figured, why not take the leap and see if it's like something I could do. So he hired me on as his business development VP of business development for his company there, where it mostly focused on that more consultative aspect of engaging with, either new customers that had like big ideas, or it was like material developing customers who were looking like for support on, how can they take this material and like wrap an application around it. So that was kind of the focus there. But unfortunately, after so many months, it kind of felt like the same kind of work that I was doing with EOS. So I decided ultimately wasn't like the right alignment for me. So, and 2020, COVID was going on. So I feel like everyone kind of took like this internal look on what they were doing and where they were doing it, and like what kind of work-life balance they were looking to achieve. So I decided I wanted to maybe find something else, but again, I kind of didn't know what I wanted to do. So I rested on my laurels a little bit, and I was able to take another role with the DoD, this time as a government contractor, actually working in that same R&D lab that I could have used, pathway I could have gone in so many years. And that was kind of scratching that itch of, where I thought I was going with EOS. All right, let me get closer to material development, process development, and the machine again, get my hands dirty. So I did that, and that was going pretty well. I was working on metals, where prior, most of my experience was polymers. We just started to do metals when I was with the Army the first time, and it just, wasn't going great, I would say. We were definitely like plastics people. So metals was a challenge, but here I was, smarter, wiser, on newer, more stable technology so many years later. And it was fun. Like I was working on RCAM, E-beam systems, and a really big, DED system that you could stand up and walk around in, playing around with like some, different materials that, weren't turnkey solutions for either system. And then I got then I had an interesting phone call with another friend within the network of the industry. And I was dabbling a little bit with doing my own like consulting work on the side at this rate. And I had a customer who wanted to talk about like post-processing capabilities in terms of smoothing and coloring. So I called up my buddy, Mike Shore, who was working for DyeMansion at the time. He was formerly with Under Armour. And I called him up and I was like, hey, you got a minute to talk about some work stuff? And he was like, yeah, like, are you looking for work? I was like, no, I actually have like, something to talk to you about kind of for my needs. But since you mentioned it, maybe we can come back to that topic. So basically 2020 into 2021 was, my play around year as far as my career went, maybe even like a little bit of a pause. But I think what happened is it showed me that there was still a direction I was looking for that I just wasn't quite finding in other places. And, knowing Mike and knowing what DyeMansion had to offer on like the post-processing side and working to bring customers like this professional industrialized finished product kind of was like very appealing to me. So I decided to give that a shot back in August of last year. And, here I still am. I'm actually very happy, and the work's, extremely engaging. The type of conversations we have with people, I really enjoy. And that was actually a part of EOS that I really enjoyed as well. It's, talking to people and helping them get to a point where their product from 3D printing is fully enabled. It looks like a professional product or an industrialized, component. And it's just, it's really fun to be like involved in those topics and that level of engagement and discussion towards that goal.
Awesome. And so can you like maybe give a couple minute overview of DyeMansion, kind of with the technology. We talked a little bit about the need in terms of what it does, but you want to just, for those who may not know much about the company, you want to just give kind of a quick overview?
Yeah, so DyeMansion's been around since about 2015. The founders kind of created the technology to develop color for a powder bed printed cell phone case. And it was one of those situations where they realized like the traditional methods of dyeing parts, pot dyeing as it's known, wasn't very effective. It was extremely inconsistent, and it wasn't like robust enough to be considered like a professional result. So they developed a coloring solution known as the DM60, and it's still like one of the main systems that we sell today. And stemming from that, it was like, well, with the existing post-processing technologies, namely cleaning, there's a lot of like inconsistencies found in that process too, with like your standard generic, blasting cabinets. So they developed an idea around like how can they make put the cleaning of powder bed parts more automated and more consistent, from cycle to cycle. And so they created the power shot system. And from there, they just kind of kept going down the line of like, all right, well, we've got cleaning, we've got dyeing. The cleaning technology quickly highlighted an ability to apply surface treatments to, powder bed parts as well. So they came out with the Power Shot S, which just uses a different media and blasting strategy to get like this more homogenized, semi-gloss surface finish on the part. And then they got into vapor smoothing just as well to deliver like sealed, water resistant surfaces that mimic that more of like an injection molded part. So that's what they offer. They offer what we call a print to product workflow, where you're allowed to do cleaning, surfacing, and coloring to deliver this, finalized industrialized component. That would be hard to distinguish between something that was injection molded versus something that was 3D printed, because we all get excited about that 3D printed part when it comes out of the machine, but we all know it needs like a little bit more when it goes kind of beyond the lab doors or the production floor. It needs to look like something more professional. And the traditional ways of post-processing, particularly for certain processes and materials, are just cumbersome and they're not scalable. So that was what they really focused on, is how can they industrialize and automate a lot of the post-processing technology.
And so on that front, I've always been curious to be interested to hear your thoughts on this. Is for so long, additive was kind of the prototyping technology, right? And like the big purchase is the printer itself, right? And you got some software, you have some ancillary equipment, a blasting cabinet, things like that. How do you approach your customer years now with, okay, like you need to buy the machine from somebody else, whether it's EOS or HP or Stratasys now or whoever it may be. And then you need all this extra equipment too. They may not know that like day one when they go into some of the machine vendors. So where in the conversation, like are people getting smarter about that? Like understanding like, hey, like I need some of this extra stuff, or like 6 months and they're like, oh crap, like the parts they showed me at the trade show, like you got to do these 2 or 3 extra steps to do it. And like, where are people netting out now in terms of kind of the finding out the equipment that they actually need to get that final injection molded kind of feel?
Yeah. So I would say it's a mix of like, a mix of some different adopters out there, based on their readiness level. So you have like your big OEMs, say like automotive companies. Mm-hmm. They know what like production needs to be. And so in terms of like equipment being this multiplying factor, they're okay with that. They just want to make sure that the equipment that they're putting in that line is going to be able to meet their needs, which are largely drawn around like, production cycle efficiencies and, bottom line in terms of dollar value. And then you've got customers who, get a 3D printer and then they kind of don't realize they need like all this other equipment. Even when they like, purchase an SLS or an SLA system, And they realize like, oh, I've got to have a cleaning station. I've got to have a bead blast cabinet. I've got to store all these chemicals. I've got to store all this powder. Like those are light bulbs for some people that don't become real until that stuff starts getting installed on their floor and they start making it. And they're like, well, what am I going to do with all this powder that I'm creating? Like, what do you mean there's a refresh rates and recycle ratios and stuff like that? So yeah, I think there's a mix between all of that of different like knowledge and readiness level. So when it comes to like the customers that we engage with kind of to that respect, it actually helps that some of them have gone through those like headaches of what the traditional post-processing is. Because when you tell them, hey, if you've got 100+ parts that you're running through you're trying to run through your machine, your blasting cabinet, multiple times a day, that's hours of work for multiple people. And we've got a machine that can do it in 10 minutes and, each cycle for 100 parts. Like that quickly becomes like a realization to them that this is a solution to a problem that I didn't know there was a solution for. So that tends to help in a lot of cases. And for people with like pot dyeing, by example, you can, I think pot dyeing works great when it's small and you're doing it here and there, but when you're trying to like make it this big industrialized system, there's service providers out there that have spent lots of money trying to make sophisticated pot dyeing systems, and they have some success to it. But if you talk to them truthfully, they'll all admit there's a lot of pain that comes with those systems. And here we are with a little system, that's got a nice market value to it. It's not too expensive, but it's priced just right, and it's got automated cleaning cycles, and they don't have to worry about the system boiling over and stirring dye and getting some kind of inconsistent shade of black, navy, purple, or blue. Like they're going to get a consistent black or colored part every time that they run it. So those light bulbs start to connect with people, and they realize like we've created something here that is ready for like production and bringing it in-house. And at the end of the day, like kind of like to your question that you maybe posed a little bit there in the beginning, compared to like the total formula of things, machine and material and all this, footprint adoption for all this equipment, at the end of the day, ours is actually like probably one of the lowest, cost factors total to the end of the cost per part ratio. We tend to be less than like 14-20% of the cost penalty, if you will, of like added value to the part, whereas the machine and the material still make up 75 60% of that part's cost.
And so today, like what's a typical day look like for you?
Yeah, so largely a remote employee. Our office here in North America is in Austin, Texas. So whether it's customer visits or, team building type things, or just, general need to take care of stuff in the office, I'm working from home or traveling to customer sites for training. So I'm what we call an application consultant. It's my job to engage, technically between our customers, our R&D teams, our product innovation teams, our sales teams, to make sure everyone's on kind of the same page of what this customer wants, and also taking that customer's feedback and relaying it to those teams, and maybe having a part in updating, improving a process that we have today, or giving us some insight on the direction that our technology needs to go into the future. So a lot of emails, a lot of phone calls, trips. Right before Rapid, I hit up 3 different states between a customer visit in Austin. We met with some resellers and customers in Montana and Minnesota. And then I was home for 2 days and flew right into Rapid, for Detroit, flew into Detroit for the Rapid show, where you're talking to people every day, of different awareness levels of the technology, and it's good stuff. So it's a lot of talking, which is something that I find that I actually enjoy doing more so today. And then every once in a while, like when I do get to visit the facilities, I am more hands-on with the equipment, helping like our on-demand service teams, work through different, workflows and stuff like that.
And so reflecting on kind of 19, 20 years in the industry now, kind of what still excites you? What gets you out of bed every day? What sorts of things do you like to continue to be excited about the industry or kind of your own career path?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, it's probably like a generic answer, but it's honestly the industry, and like the direction that I do feel like it is going. You know, being in it for these 20 years and getting the privilege of going to different shows like AMUG, for one. I remember back in the day, there was this fear of like a traditional 2D printing company. Realistically, they could have come into the market and bought everybody and condensed the industry under one player, so to speak, spun off whatever they wanted to do, and they would have had the power and money to do that. And I felt like there was a true fear to that. And then 3D printing blew up, and it was just like you'd have these conversations with people, and they'd be like, "Oh, have you heard about 3D printing?" And I explained to them what we called rapid prototyping, what that was, and then additive manufacturing became a term, and so yeah, I think the way that the industry has been evolving, the growth of metals. Even though I'm still a plastic guy, there's a lot of cool things happening with metals. And I'm excited honestly to be on the side of it that I'm on now with the polymer industry, to see the polymers, because of the enablement of post-processing technologies, to see like more excitement happening on, polymer parts becoming in-use products at scale and at volume. So yeah, that's definitely what I would say excites me nowadays.
Awesome. Well, good stuff. More to come, and really appreciate you joining the episode today and sharing your career story.
Yeah. Thank you, Mike. It was a pleasure.